36%. For a long, suspended moment, I genuinely believed I had misread the column. I leaned closer to the screen, blinking slowly, waiting for the figures to rearrange themselves into something that felt right. They refused. The document had landed in my inbox by mistake, one of those careless internal forwards meant only for the senior partners, but somehow copied to the entire operations team. The subject line was harmless enough: Q2 remuneration alignment, internal review only. Most people probably scrolled past it. I opened it because logistics scheduling was my responsibility, and what appeared on my monitor turned the air in my lungs to stone. Tobias Quinlan, hired 14 months ago, $128,400. Aroha Whitcomb, hired 10 months ago, $124,900. Declan Marsh, 8 months in the company, $131,200. Every single one of them had sat across from me during onboarding. I had walked them through our route management system, taught them how to flag carrier discrepancies, shown them how to survive a port closure without grinding the entire South Island operation to a halt. Then I found my own name, Eilish Brannigan, 8 years and 4 months with the company. Base salary, $94,300. I stared at that line until the digits seemed to swim. If anything I share in the next few minutes resonates with you, please tap the like button now, because at that exact moment, I had no idea I was 3 days away from doing something that would crack open every quiet rule the company had built around me. I would also love to know where you are tuning in from and what time of day it is for you. I always find it remarkable how far these stories travel. I had spent more than 8 years at Halewood Freightline Group, our Auckland-headquartered logistics firm with depots from Whangarei down to Bluff. 8 years of long handovers, missed birthdays, late ferry crossings, broken tracking systems, impossible deadlines, and a kind of loyalty I had mistaken for commitment. I had built nearly every operational workflow the dispatchers now relied on, and the people I had personally trained were earning roughly 36% more than I was, sitting one row across from my desk. Declan laughed at something on his phone. I closed the spreadsheet, saved a copy to my private cloud, and felt something inside me settle into a strange, cold stillness. For another minute, I sat there, staring at the screen even after the figures had already burned themselves into the back of my mind. Around me, the office continued as if nothing had shifted. The coffee machine groaned, a printer rattled in the back corner, someone near the breakout area laughed too loudly at a joke I could not hear. Everything was ordinary, except I no longer felt ordinary inside it. 3 minutes later, a follow-up email landed. Please disregard the previous message. It was sent in error. That was the entirety of it. No apology, no explanation, just a tidy little recall, as though they could fold the truth back into the dark after letting it breathe by accident. I had already saved a copy. I closed my laptop, stood up, smoothed my jacket, and walked toward my manager's office. My manager was Hamish Cordwell. He had been my direct supervisor for the better part of 5 years, and he knew exactly what I had carried for that company. He knew about the nights I stayed until the cleaners arrived, the weekends I spent rebuilding the freight allocation tool when no one else understood the underlying logic. He knew how often the partners praised reports that only existed because I had quietly fixed the broken systems behind them. I knocked twice. Eilish, he said, looking up from his screen with a careful smile. Is something the matter? I placed my laptop on his desk and opened the document. I need you to explain this. His eyes moved across the screen. For the briefest flicker, I saw it. Not surprise. Recognition. He already knew. Then he leaned back, folded his hands, and gave me the answer I would replay in my head for weeks afterwards. Eilish, I'm not really in a position to discuss other employees' pay arrangements. I'm not asking about theirs, I said carefully. I'm asking about mine. He sighed the way a person sighs when they have been handed an inconvenient errand. The market has shifted. New hires come in under different conditions. It's just how things have moved. Then move mine too. It isn't that simple. I stared at him for a long moment. After everything I had carried, after every quiet save, every weekend rescue, every system I had built without being asked, that was his answer. Not gratitude. Not fairness. Just policy. I picked up my laptop, thanked him for his time the way you thank a stranger holding a door, and walked back to my desk with a strange calm settling over me. It was not peace. It was something closer to a door clicking shut inside my chest. For the rest of the day, I worked without speaking much. I answered emails, approved 3 handover reports, signed off on a vehicle reallocation, and corrected a data entry error in a forecast Aroha had submitted. The routine almost made me laugh. Even after seeing the truth, I was still protecting the same company that had quietly chosen not to protect me. That evening, I drove home to my flat in Mount Eden, kicked my boots into the corner, and sat at the kitchen table with my laptop open. I did not cry. I did not call my older sister Niam. I did not message my best mate Rosalind, who would have told me without hesitation that I deserved better. I already knew I deserved better. Instead, I started writing. At first, it was only a timeline. Hired as a junior logistics coordinator, rebuilt the multi-depot freight allocation template that had been causing repeated errors during peak season. Designed the carrier scorecard that the partners later presented at the industry conference in Wellington. Identified a customs misclassification on bonded shipments that could have cost the company more than $620,000 in penalties. Drafted the freight insurance protocol that became mandatory across all 4 regional hubs. The list kept growing. I noted every system I had built, every emergency I had pulled the company out of, every audit I had quietly steered through, every workflow that still carried my fingerprints embedded in its logic. I added the names of the people I had trained: Tobias Quinlan, Aroha Whitcomb, Declan Marsh, 2 others who had already moved into supervisor roles before midnight. By 2 a.m, my anger had hardened into arithmetic. Arithmetic had become evidence. I calculated conservative savings from process improvements, prevented penalties, avoided downtime, and training contributions. The total was larger than I had expected. By sunrise, I had a document that no one in any boardroom could dismiss with a sigh. It was not emotional. It was not dramatic. It was a structured account of 8 years of being underestimated. I saved the final draft under a title that felt almost too restrained for what it contained. I called it The Quiet Cost of Operational Memory. 47 pages. Every page was clean, dated, indexed, and supported by figures. No accusations, no begging, no bitterness. Only facts, timelines, comparisons, financial impact, and the kind of forensic detail Halewood Freightline had taught me to value when it benefited them. On the final page, I included the simplest calculation in the entire document. My estimated value contribution to the company in the previous 12 months alone was $312,000. The salary adjustment required to bring me anywhere near market rate was $34,500. Even running on no sleep, I smiled at that. The maths was almost insulting. I printed the document at a 24-hour copy center on Dominion Road, had it bound in dark navy leather, and went home just long enough to shower. I chose my charcoal suit, a cream blouse, and the leather flats I only wore when I needed to remind myself that I belonged in any room I walked into. Then I opened the email I had been ignoring for 3 months. It was from Southern Compass Logistics, a smaller but rapidly growing competitor based out of Hamilton. The offer was clean: $142,000 base salary, a meaningful equity component, stronger health benefits, and a senior operations lead role under Margot Belrose, a former Halewood regional director who had left 2 years earlier after watching the partners pass her over for a promotion she had unmistakably earned. She understood, perhaps better than anyone, how much invisible labor companies like ours preferred to consume before they were forced to admit it had a price tag. I printed the offer letter. Then, I printed my resignation. At 7 minutes past 7 in the morning, the executive floor of Halewood Freightline was nearly empty. The glass walls reflected the soft gray of the Auckland sunrise, and for the first time in years, I did not feel small walking past them. The managing director, Jeffrey Penhaligon, had not arrived yet. His assistant's desk was untouched. I stepped into his office. In the center of his polished Kari desk, I placed 3 things in a tidy stack: my resignation letter, the offer from Southern Compass Logistics, and my bound analysis. Then I walked back downstairs, sat at my desk, opened my inbox, and began reviewing the weekly carrier compliance report as if nothing had changed. But everything had. Do you agree with what I did? Documenting my contribution, presenting the truth, and refusing to stay quiet after years of being underpaid? If you stand with that decision, please tap the like button now and let me know. At 23 minutes past 9, my desk phone rang. The managing director's extension. Eilish, he said, his voice too carefully measured. Could you come up to my office, please? I'll be there shortly. I took my time saving the report I was working on, picked up my notebook, and walked toward the lifts. Around me, the office had shifted. People were pretending not to look, which only made their attention louder. The compensation document had clearly traveled faster than HR had been able to recall. When I reached his office, the door was already open. Inside sat Jeffrey Penhaligon, my manager Hamish Cordwell, our HR director Bridget Ackerley, and our chief operating officer Cilius McTavish. My bound analysis lay open on the desk, several pages flagged with small yellow tabs. Please close the door, he said. I did. He gestured to the empty chair, but I remained standing. We've reviewed your document. It is extremely thorough. Thank you. Bridget shifted in her seat. Eilish, I think there's been a misunderstanding around how compensation has been structured. There is no misunderstanding, I said evenly. I have worked here for over 8 years. I trained the people who now earn close to 36% more than I do. When I asked about it yesterday, I was told it was simply policy, so I made a business decision based on that policy. Hamish looked down at his hands. Jeffrey leaned back in his chair. Your resignation does feel rather sudden. It took 8 years, I replied. The room went very quiet. Celia studied me with an expression I could not quite read. What would it take for you to reconsider? I had prepared for that question. My salary brought to $148,000. Retroactive compensation for the disparity over the past year, paid as a one-off bonus, a formal title that reflects what I actually do, and a company-wide review of remuneration practices to identify other employees in the same position. Bridget's mouth opened slightly. Jeffrey's eyes narrowed. That is highly unusual. So is allowing one person to build your operational infrastructure, train half your team, and carry institutional knowledge for over 8 years while paying her below the people she trained. Nobody answered. Through the glass wall, I could see the office pretending not to watch. For the first time in years, they were not weighing me. They were calculating the cost of losing me. Jeffrey tapped one finger against the leather cover of my analysis, slowly, as though the sound might purchase him a little time. Give us 24 hours, he said finally. We need to prepare a proper response. I nodded. My resignation gives you a fortnight. Hamish glanced up sharply. A fortnight isn't going to be enough. No, I said. It won't. That was the moment the room genuinely changed. Until then, they had treated my resignation as a salary disagreement, something uncomfortable but containable. Now they were beginning to understand what my leaving actually meant. I was not simply the woman who closed weekly reports and corrected forecasts. I was the person who knew why the carrier reconciliation pulled data from 3 separate legacy systems that had never been properly integrated. I knew which freight contracts contained quiet renewal clauses that auto-triggered if no one acted by a specific date. I knew the manual workaround that kept our customs filings aligned when the software dropped fields every other quarter. I knew the passwords that had never migrated properly to the new platform. The compliance calendar nobody else opened. The reporting exceptions that looked harmless until they became expensive. And, most importantly, I knew what was not written down anywhere. My knowledge transfer plan is in Section 11, I said. It outlines the realistic minimum timeline for training replacements and avoiding operational gaps. Celius flipped to that section, and I watched her face tighten. 75 days? She asked. At the absolute minimum. Bridget swallowed audibly. Jeffrey's expression hardened, but beneath it, I could see panic beginning to rise. You mentioned Southern Compass Logistics. Who reached out to you there? Margot? The name landed in the room like a glass slipping from someone's hand. Margot had left Halewood almost 3 years earlier, under circumstances that had been spoken about in low voices for months afterwards. She had since helped Southern Compass grow into one of our most aggressive competitors on every contract that mattered. Everyone in that room knew it. Hamish stared at me. "You're going to work for her." "I am considering a business opportunity," I said. Just as Halewood considered its compensation policy, nobody corrected me. Jeffrey eventually stood, walked to the window, and looked out across the harbor. His reflection in the glass looked older than it had a quarter of an hour earlier. I picked up my notebook. "You have 24 hours, I said quietly. Then I walked out, leaving them with the arithmetic they should have completed years ago. Back at my desk, I could feel the entire floor watching me, without ever quite looking directly at me. Tobias became suddenly absorbed in his keyboard. Aroha whispered something to Declan, then stopped the moment I walked past. The office had always carried its share of quiet judgment, but that morning it carried something new: unease. I sat down, opened my laptop, and ignored the unread messages stacking up in our internal chat. Instead, I opened a folder buried 4 layers deep in my personal notes. It was not about my salary. It was about something significantly larger. The first irregular payment had appeared roughly 20 months earlier. A consulting invoice for $11,800 paid to a company I did not recognize, listed in our system as Halford Strategic Advisory. There was no corresponding purchase order, no attached engagement letter, no scope of work, no project summary, only a clean payment authorization and Hamish's note in the field, approved by partner directive. I had flagged it at the time. Hamish had told me, gently, that I did not need to worry about it. 2 months later, another payment appeared. Different vendor, identical structure. No documentation, a tidy figure, just under the threshold that triggered automatic review. Then another. Then another. At first, I assumed it was nothing more than sloppy record-keeping. Halewood had plenty of that, but the pattern became too precise to dismiss. The vendors all had bland, forgettable names. Their websites, where they existed at all, were hollow single-page placeholders. Their addresses traced back to mailbox services in Auckland CBD or, in 2 cases, a serviced office on the Gold Coast in Australia. Their payment schedules repeated like a metronome every quarter, almost to the day, so I began tracking them privately, quietly, carefully, for 19 months. I logged each transaction, each authorization, each absent document, each account code that had been very subtly altered to make the payments look ordinary in a routine ledger review. By the time I had finished mapping the entire pattern, the total had reached just over $3.4 million. Someone had been quietly draining Halewood Freightline from the inside. And the same people who had dismissed my worth were sitting on top of a financial scandal they did not realize I had already documented in full. That was the secret I had not placed inside my 47-page analysis. Not yet. Just after lunch, my phone rang again. This time it was Sileus. "Eilish, could you join us in the Rangitoto meeting room?" Not the managing director's office. Not a casual catch-up. A meeting room meant they wanted a structured environment, written outcomes, and witnesses. When I entered, Jeffrey was already seated at the head of the long table, with Sileus on his right and Bridget on his left. Hamish sat near the far end with a folder open in front of him. There was one new face in the room. Our chief legal counsel, Elliot Vandermeer. That single fact told me more than any expression in the room. "Please sit, Eilish," Jeffrey said. I sat, placed my notebook on the table, and waited. "We've reviewed your concerns very seriously, and we agree your contribution has not been properly reflected in your compensation." It was extraordinary how quickly language softened once fear entered a room. Bridget slid a folder across the table. I read it slowly. Base salary adjusted to $151,000, effective immediately. A retention bonus of $42,000. New title, Director of Operational Strategy. Direct participation in partner-level meetings. Expanded authority over reporting controls and process governance. It was more than I had asked for, and exactly as desperate as I had expected. Hamish gave me a tight, hopeful smile. "We hope this shows how much we value you." I looked at the figure on the page, then at him. Funny how value appeared the moment departure became expensive. This is acceptable as a compensation framework, I said. Jeffrey exhaled, almost with relief. Then Elliot cleared his throat. There is one additional document, he said, sliding another folder across the table. A standard confidentiality agreement linked to your new role. It covers internal compensation materials, operational records, and any irregularities you may have observed during your employment. I kept my expression perfectly still. Irregularities? I asked. Standard wording, he replied smoothly, but his eyes did not move the way standard wording moves. I closed the folder and rested my hand on top of it. I'll need time to review this carefully before signing. For the next fortnight, I became extraordinarily good at asking thoughtful, polite questions. I sent the confidentiality agreement back to Elliot twice, once for unclear scope, once for overly broad language about retained materials. Each delay was professional, courteous, and impossible to criticize. Meanwhile, I continued doing my job, attending partner-level meetings, and watching certain people grow more visibly tense every time I mentioned documentation. On the 15th day, Jeffrey called one final meeting in the Rangitoto room. This time, the room was full. Jeffrey at the head of the table, Silius beside him, Hamish looking pale, Bridget avoiding my eyes. Elliot arrived last, carrying his briefcase like a shield. On the large screen at the far end of the room was Catriona Halberd, the chairwoman of Halewood's board of directors, joining from her home office in Christchurch. Jeffrey began with a careful smile. Eilish, thank you for your patience. We're ready to finalize your new role today. Before we do, I said, placing a slim folder on the table, there's something the board needs to see. Elliot's eyes sharpened immediately. I handed copies around the table and sent the digital file through to Catriona. This is an 18-page report documenting approximately $3.4 million diverted from Halewood Freightline over the past 3 years through shell vendors and unsupported consulting payments. Nobody moved. I continued. The payments were structured below review thresholds, coded across multiple departments, and routed through entities that have no genuine operational footprint. Catriona leaned closer to her screen. Who authorized them on paper? Several approvals appear routine on the surface, but the entities all trace back to a single holding company called Caramore Holdings Limited. Elliot's jaw tightened. Caramore was registered through a family connection, I said. The formation documents were signed by the chief legal counsel's brother-in-law, a man named Donovan Trelawney. That is absurd, Elliot snapped. I turned to the final page. The same signature appears on the filing documents for a property trust connected to your wife's name. The room went silent. For the first time since I had opened that misdirected email, Elliot looked frightened. Catriona ended the meeting within minutes and ordered an independent investigation before Elliot could say another word. Security walked him from the building that same afternoon. By the end of the week, external counsel and a forensic accounting firm had taken over half the executive floor. The truth traveled faster than Halewood could contain it. Elliot eventually faced criminal charges. 2 finance team members who had quietly processed the fictitious vendor payments were dismissed and later investigated. Hamish was placed on administrative leave while the board reviewed why my warnings had been ignored for nearly 20 months. He was not accused of dishonesty, but negligence carries its own quiet cost. Halewood survived, but not as the company it had been. Long-standing clients began asking pointed questions about internal controls. Several moved their contracts to competitors within months. Jeffrey tried to steady the firm, but the board eventually pushed him out in a quiet vote. Silius resigned not long afterwards. 2.5 years later, Halewood Freightline was acquired by a larger Australian operator for considerably less than its previous valuation. As for me, I joined Southern Compass Logistics under Margot Belrose, not as a wounded employee looking to be rescued, but as a senior operations leader who finally understood what she was worth. One of my first projects was to build a transparent compensation review framework for the entire company. Nobody in my department would ever discover by accident that loyalty had quietly made them cheaper. 2 years later, I was promoted to Chief Operating Officer. My niece, Saoirse, who is 14 now, and convinced she wants to study commerce, asked me last Christmas why I had stayed at my old job for so long. I told her the honest answer. I had stayed because I had believed, like a great many people do, that hard work alone would eventually be noticed, rewarded, and respected. I had stayed because I had mistaken being needed for being valued. Sometimes, the moment that breaks your heart is also the moment that finally wakes up your courage. People occasionally ask whether I regret what I did. I do not. I regret only how long I waited. I regret the years I spent translating my exhaustion into proof that I was still committed. I regret believing that being indispensable was the same as being protected. Through everything I lived through, I have come to hold a few quiet truths close. Loyalty should never become the reason someone is allowed to undervalue you. Your worth is measured by your impact, not by how patiently you tolerate unfairness. Documentation will protect you on the days when emotion will not be heard. The truth often takes longer to surface than you expect, but when it is supported by evidence, it carries an enormous weight. Walking away is not a defeat. Sometimes it is the most powerful sentence a person can write about their own life. And finally, the workplaces that mistake your silence for agreement are the ones least prepared for what happens when you finally speak. If you ever find yourself sitting in front of a screen, looking at a number that makes the air in your chest turn cold, remember that you are not unreasonable for asking the question. You are not ungrateful for wanting fairness. And you are certainly not alone. What about you? Has a story like this ever brushed against your own life? Share it in the comments below. And if any of this resonated with you, please consider subscribing, tapping the like button, and sharing this with someone who needs to be reminded today that knowing your worth is not arrogance. It is the deepest form of self-respect. Welcome to Broken Legends, where quiet people finally find their voice.